Okay, thanks very much, Alva, and thank you everyone for coming along to hear a little bit about the Westmeath Field Names Project and some general comments about place names, field names, and minor place names in Ireland. So, um, some of the general background. So there is something unique, I think, about Irish language, culture, and place names, and that goes quite a long way back. So Jeremiah Curtin, the well-known folklorist, made these comments in 1895 when he was collecting folklore in the Corcaigeen area of County Kerry. My host, Maurice Fitzgerald, was a man who knew the whole countryside well, spoke Gaelic with more ease than English. He knew the Gaelic name of every field within 2 miles of his house and the name of every hill, cliff, and mountain for many a mile. It may be stated that there in the Gaelic speaking parts of Ireland there is a most complete system of naming every spot that needs to be distinguished from those around it. And I think there's a fair amount of truth in that, and that's been demonstrated by a lot of the research work that has been done, which has tended to focus on Gaeltacht or Irish speaking areas where there tends to be a huge density of place names. And the question, I suppose, is did that exist all over Ireland when Irish was more broadly spoken? I think that's probably likely. A few examples, Nollaig Ó well-known Irish language scholar and historian, collected 600 names from 12 townlands in Tuairricéide, which be the Mayo Gaeltacht in the 1970s when the area was Irish speaking. There isn't that much Irish spoken there. And he collected 600 names on Clare Island in the same county where Irish was probably spoken until the 1930s. So anywhere Irish is spoken or was recently spoken, you'll get a lot of names. But also in counties like my own county, County Westmeath, you still get a lot of Irish names and a lot of very interesting English names as well, several generations or even 5 or 6 generations after the language shift. So it's worthwhile collecting names in every part of Ireland. Now, place names are not unique to Ireland, they exist everywhere. But we do have a unique situation in Ireland that the language in which most of the place names originate is now only spoken by a small minority and is geographically unevenly distributed to a number of small areas, mostly on the western seaboard and maybe individual families scattered around the country. And the language shift was an extremely dramatic event in Irish history. Tends to be underplayed by historians. I think they usually get rid of it in the first chapter of an introduction or something to general histories of Ireland. But really unusual in European context for a language with a very high status and a long literary tradition such as Irish to be so completely marginalized in a couple of generations. So you can see from the map there, Irish 200 years ago was spoken almost everywhere apart from maybe South Wexford and Northeast Ulster around Belfast and so on, and was the majority language in most of the country, geographically speaking. And even 100 years ago was still there were still Irish speakers in many counties. So, what are field names and minor place names? So, minor place names is a bit of an awkward term, but I suppose it refers to names other than townland names and town names and names which are part of the administrative system in the country tend to be used in more informal contexts, only known at a local level or sometimes only known within a family or a couple of families. There are huge numbers of them, hundreds and hundreds of thousands. Some of them appear on estate maps or even ordnance survey maps. Some appear in newspaper advertisements in the 19th and 20th century advertising lands to let, but it's fair to say the vast majority haven't been written down anywhere and are simply used orally and survive in that way, and in that way can be lost quite quickly, as changes happen socially and economically in rural areas. Um, Professional researchers have focused on the Gaeltacht probably because of the continuing rapid shift to English in most Gaeltacht areas, and there's been seen to be a pressing need to collect names there. And we have amazing collections like those from Dún Queen and County Kerry, 800 names, including many field names. Pádraig Carroll, who used to be the Chief Place Names Officer in the Department of the Gaeltacht, collected 200 to 300 place names from a single townland in Joyce Country, County Galway. And there's only about 10 houses in that townland. So that just goes to show you the sheer wealth of names that survive. Minor place names are very, very numerous, and no individual can ever cover a large area. So, what we have collected is probably only scratching the surface. Um, some of the big projects in recent years have been community led, which I think is a good approach, because bringing in a large number of people can vastly increase the amount of names you can collect. So the Mead Field Names Project, probably the most prominent, 25,000 names collected during the period 2008, 2013. And I think the IFA were very involved, and they had sponsorship from, I think, FPD and maybe the Farmers Journal. And it was a very broad-based project and did great work. Some interesting outcomes there of that. About 10% of the names were Irish origin, and many interesting English dialect words which were peculiar maybe to Meath or to that part of Leinster. The Loud Field Names project then was maybe a slightly smaller project, but interestingly, about 20% of the names were of Irish origin there, which probably reflects the fact that the Cooley Peninsula was Irish speaking until, well, probably the 1920s, so later than other parts of North Leinster. There've been projects in Kilkenny, different parts of Connemara, our own project in Westmeath, and to be honest, the list continues to expand. From what I know of, there are projects in different parts of County Dublin, in Kildare, in Kerry, Armagh, South Down, in County Roscommon. I know people have been in touch with me from County Clare, and there's probably a few people from Clare listening to this tonight. Joyce Country, I've mentioned, Erisaneach in Galway, be around the Corna areas. Um, and then, of course, there are current projects. There's lots of older work which has been done on the Aran Islands and Connemara by people like Tim Robinson, and also in the Burren, in the Waterford Gaeltacht, Ratland Island, many different parts of the country. So there are a lot of scattered collections of field names, and some of this material is available in book form, some of it is independently available online, some of it is available on loganim.ie, which is the place names database of Ireland, but by no means all. And interestingly, since 2016, we have had a national database specifically for minor place names or field names, um, called mehel.loganim.ie, which is sort of a sister website to loganim.ie. And the aim of that website is that community groups or individuals can lodge a collection of names that they've already collected onto that national database, which is linked to, electronic map, or you can actually go into the map and collect a name, document a name on the map directly there. You can even make a sound recording of the pronunciation. It's a difficult enough website to use, I think that's fair to say, but it's very important that it's there. It's funded by the Department of the Gaeltacht, and it should be secure and archived for the future. So if anybody here has been collecting names, they should consider adding their collection to that website, which is, I think, hosted by the Irish Department in Dublin City University. So one other collection I'm going to mention is, I think it's particularly interesting, is the field names of Glenasmole, which Andy McGillicole has been working on, who's also a researcher in the Place Names branch in Dublin. And he's collected several hundred field names in Glenasmole in the Dublin Mountains, just a few miles from the M50. And about 50% of them are of Irish language origin. And it seems that Irish was spoken a little bit later in that part of the Dublin Mountains and maybe other parts of North Leinster. So it's amazing what field names can reveal. You really wouldn't expect Irish to have been spoken so recently, uh, so close to Dublin. But there we have it. Now, the most important piece of work done about or with regard to collecting field names is probably the Schools Folklore Collection. So I'm presuming a lot of people here are familiar with the Schools Folklore Collection. It's available online at duchas.ie, and it was a huge undertaking in the 1930s. About 5,000 schools took part. I think about 50,000 children or perhaps more, and produced a couple of 100,000 handwritten pages of folklore collected under 55 different titles. And one of those was place names. So this is the original handbook which was distributed to the teachers and the schools all over the country. There was an Irish version and an English version. So this is áiteanmacha, scríobh síos liste agus na hanmacha atá gach páirt, srahán, crochan, logan, carrig mhór, erim tahar, so wala. So it's an interesting introduction here. We've had the 1926 census released recently showing that about 50% of the population were involved in agriculture in 1926. This dates to 1937. So I'd say the figure had only dropped slightly. And this is the direction given to teachers and to pupils to collect field names. Write down a list of the fields, the names of every field, stream, hillock, hollow, big rock, and so on your father's farm at home. So it's interesting that it's presumed that the child would be on a farm. It's presumed as well that the farmer would be male, which wouldn't have been the case in every case, but probably in most cases. And it's clear who they were aiming at. They were aiming at the majority of the population who were rurally based, and even those who didn't live on a farm, probably weren't too far removed from one. Now, that's not to say there wasn't folklore collected in urban areas. There was, and it's very valuable. Actually, it's one of the faults of the Schools Folklore Collection that maybe the focus on rural areas was excessive, because there was certainly equally valuable folklore available in urban areas. But some schools in towns opted not to participate on the basis that as urban areas, there wouldn't be the same wealth of tradition, which I don't think was true. But nonetheless, the focus was on rural areas, and huge numbers of field names and minor place names were collected as part of this project. So what I have now on a few slides, sorry, is how the pupils in the 1930s saw field names when they were responding to this request to collect names in their own area. So I have one here from Welsh Island and County Offaly. It is very common nowadays with our Irish farmers to have different names on all the fields by which to describe them. Even a very clever dog would know to which field to go for the cattle by hearing the farmer use it. Each field got its name from something around it or something that happened in it. And a shorter one here, nearly every field in this district has a name to distinguish it from other fields. The fields were named by the old Irish people and they still bear these names. Not sure what is meant by the old Irish people. Perhaps a reference to older Irish speakers. I'm not sure, or the memory of there being Irish speaking people in the area. Now, interesting, when we were collecting names in Cosin outside Athlone as part of my own project in County Westmeath, we got an even more concise definition about field names. Paul Slater, who'd be probably in his 80s now, born in the 1930s, so born at the time of the Schools Folklore Collection, said to me, field names, you're looking for field names. You know what field names are? Where to go with the cow in the morning. That's how he could, conceptualized field names. In other words, how he got to know field names was after milking the 3 or 4 cows he would have been told where to bring them to graze for the day. I think it's worth mentioning, how things have changed, because I'd say there are very few or maybe no children in the country who, are told where to go with the cow in the morning. And this is how this information was transmitted, but it's also why this information existed. It had an everyday importance. all the different areas, the grazing resource and the farm would have had a name, and it was important to know where to go. So this points to the fact that uh, there's a huge risk of a lot of important traditional information which connects people and communities to their own area being lost, for simple reasons that, farming has changed and how people live in rural areas has changed. Many people have an urban lifestyle, even though they may be deeply rooted in a rural area. So, a little bit about my own project, the Westmeath Field Names Project. It's a community-based project. We've had 17 different community groups and then lots of individuals from all sorts of areas all over County Westmeath, funded by the Heritage Council, Creative Ireland and Westmeath County Council. We've had huge support from Melanie McQuaid, the Heritage Officer in Westmeath, and I don't think the project ever would have happened without her support. The audience here tonight now mightn't be too familiar with the geography of Westmeath, but we've a good spread from Lough Valley, Topman in the north of the county, to places like Coosan near Athlone. Westmeath is almost two counties, a sort of an area centred on Athlone and another larger area centred on Mullingar. We've had a good spread throughout all parts of the county, certainly not universal coverage, but we have sampled most areas. So these are the community groups, usually a pre-existing group like, um, an age action group, or it could be local IFA or Irish Country Women's Association, or a local heritage group, will express an interest in taking part in the project. We've also recorded from individuals where we go and talk to farmers, or sometimes even do it by phone, and collect names from their area in that way. It's a very simple process. It's paper based. When we started off, we thought we would be using uh, smartphones, seeing as most people have smartphones, including the people who know, uh, you know, are most knowledgeable of local traditions, people in their 70s and 80s. They all would come to the meetings with their smartphones, but what we found is they didn't want to use them to actually record the names. They were much more comfortable with pen and paper, and so we went with that. So we usually use the Ordnance Survey 6-inch maps, the last edition. So they would be based on a survey done in the late 19th century or early 20th century. So they usually match up fairly well to how the landscape was laid out before maybe a lot of land reclamation started to take off in the 50s and 60s. So within living memory, we'd also give out aerial photographs as well. We number all the fields in an individual townland, and then we give people a record sheet, and they simply match the number of the field to the name of the field if the field has a name. Not every field has a name by any means, but quite a lot do. And then they record their source, which could be the local landowner or it could be themselves, and some contact details so we can follow up on the information. So it's a very simple process. Sometimes we would gather a lot of people together in a meeting, give them out maps, and they would start working straight away. And I would be available there then to help out or to maybe record the pronunciation. And that was actually quite a good way of doing it. If you have somebody who, is experienced in place names and is, familiar with Irish in particular is important, but also important to understand the local accent and the local usage of different words. If you have somebody who's fairly adept in that area, it can be very good to get them to sit in on meetings and to record contextual information, record aspects of local pronunciation, which can help to interpret the name later. The pure community approach has its limitations. Um, Simply because that kind of expertise, is not often available at a local level. So if you can get somebody to advise on the names, it's well worthwhile. My general advice on recording names is not to overinterpret at the recording stage, but simply to write them as they're pronounced, um, and not to standardize spelling or presume a particular interpretation at that stage. Sometimes there's a bit of a mess of a slide, but sometimes if I'm recording from an individual, I'll just write the names on the map. It can be quicker. Sometimes, people are busy. If you're talking to farmers and so on, it's easy to just to spread a map out on the bonnet of the car, whatever, and write in the names. So sometimes we do it like that as well if I'm doing a place names interview myself. Now, place names can be tricky. So I'm going to look at two or three examples of, well, which show the difficulty of interpreting names and how names have been reinterpreted within the oral tradition. So these two fields here, it's the two fields here with the trees sort of centered in the field. Big Pullineer and Little Pullineer is how they were recorded on our record sheet. And I knew straight away when I saw that written that, there was something strange going on here. They were also recorded in the Schools Folklore Collection with somewhat obscure spelling. It's something like Puilimweir. I think the M is probably meant to be an N. So it's probably something like Puilineer. And the local pronunciation then is Pullineer. Pullineer. So I think this is probably pull on eel, the hole or the pit of the lime. And, lime kilns were a very, very important part of land management before artificial fertilizers became available. And there are lime kilns to be found all over the country. So it seems likely that stone was dug in these fields to be burnt in lime kilns, but has been reinterpreted due to a change in the sound from an L to an R, which is something that can happen quite easily, as pull in ear. So again, probably wouldn't be too obvious if you hadn't spent a lot of time looking at names like these, as to how you would interpret that. So they can be very tricky. Now, another example of why getting the local pronunciation is very important and ideally making a sound recording uh, is this one here. So if we look at the record sheet up here, and the spelling is Garrrhia. So when I got that, it was actually collected during COVID. So I was sitting at home looking at record sheets that came to me in the post. And I said to myself, Garhia, 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 how would that be pronounced? And without the pronunciation, it's very hard for somebody like me to work out what sort of name I'm dealing with, especially if it's an Irish name which has been anglicized. So I rang up the farmer. It's actually a dairy farmer, and I got hold of him and I said, I'm looking at one here. It starts with a G. Oh yeah, I said, I know that one. I said, how would you say that in a normal, natural way? If you were somebody asked you where the cows were, I'd say, oh, the cows are up in Garrahaya. Garahaya. So Garahaya, that pronunciation allows me to interpret the name. There's two parts to it, really, or two elements. So the first word is probably Gari, which is a garden or small field. And the second part is probably, I think, the word oich, which is the Irish for a kiln or a lime kiln again. And if we look at the site here, there are lots of limestone outcrops in the field, and it's right next to a raised bog, which would have been a source of fuel. So it would have been a very good site for either a lime kiln or also a kiln for drying corn. There were also kilns specially made for drying corn, where the corn was stacked and then heat was uh, sort of a fire was lit in a stone under a stone kind of structure underneath to dry the corn. So a corn drying kiln. So we can't be 100% of the interpretation there, but it's vastly easier when we have an accurate sound recording of the name. Another one here, the spelling on the record sheet was Slotha for the N. So quite difficult for me to be sure of the quality of the vowel there. So quick phone call. I think the conversation lasted about 20 seconds and we got the pronunciation Slohan. Slohan, which is probably a local form of the Irish word slochtón, which is the name for the sow thistle or sow thistle, which is very common on waste ground or fallows or old tillage ground. So probably at some point in the past, it could be 100 or 200 years ago, there was, preponderance of thistles in that field for a year or for a few years, and it acquired that name. So it's remarkable something as fleeting as that can be embedded within the cultural memory attached to that place. Slohan. Another one which presented a challenge interpretation wise is this name, the raw meal, uh, Ballycladuff, near Mount Temple, County Westmeath. So this was collected by Peter Buckley, and I think it's actually probably an Irish name on the raw wheel, the bear ringfort. So wheel would be how the word bear, whale, maybe in Munster Irish would have been pronounced in the Irish that was spoken in Westmeath. Similar to Connacht Irish, we have a word like mealcly, which survives locally in English speech for a bare earthen bank, a bank or a ditch between fields with no vegetation on it, and mealcly. Now, to complicate matters, Buckley's mill, which was in use until the 1960s, is right beside this field. So people tended to presume it was something to do with the mill. The mill was mainly for grinding, cattle, for grain for feeding to cattle and so on, rather than a flour mill. And the usual word would be meal. I don't think it is an English name in this case. For one reason, the traditional pronunciation would be male rather than meal, and the name is very clearly recorded locally as the raw meal. So I think it's more likely it's the Irish word, and raw is a reflection of the word raw, ringfort, or after th. So we can look at the mapping evidence. I don't know if people can see that on their screens, but there's a huge number of ringforts in the area. 1, 2, 3, 4 at least, and that we can see on the OS map. I think there's more on the archaeological survey. Now, this field called the Raw Wheel is this big field here, and there are no ring forts shown on the archaeological survey or on the OS map, but in the aerial photograph, you can see what looks like the outline of a ring fort here. So field names have a value in uncovering archaeological features in the landscape which are no longer visible and may not be recorded in other collections or formally recorded in archaeological surveys or ordnance survey maps. So a little bit more about the Schools Folklore Collection. We did look specifically at the names collected in County Westmeath as part of our project. And something that has been always very useful is to compare what was collected in the 1930s to what's known today. And in general, a lot of what was collected in the 1930s still survives today, but there have been a certain amount of losses, particularly where land has been sold or people have moved away from an area. In those circumstances, names can be lost. All the traditions relating to a particular farm can disappear. So 112 schools took part in the Schools Folklore Collection in County Westmeath, and in 2022 we extracted a list of over 2,000 names from the duchas.ie website. Now, we later discovered some of them were actually Townland names, so we whittled them down. So it's about 1,850 minor place names. But having done some more spot checking since, I think we missed a few. So I'd say the true figure is over 2,000 names. And a lot of these names are recorded in different forms of spelling. You have to remember they were recorded by children of the ages 10 to 14 years of age, usually. Sometimes they use English spelling, something like how Townland names are spelled on Ordnance Survey maps. Sometimes they use Irish spelling. Sometimes they use a mix. So you see here, Borin, we have the I Fada, but the rest of it is English spelling. Tubber, Neddy, Odie's, Borin, and so on. So you get a mix of the Irish spelling system and English spelling, which sometimes works well in conveying the pronunciation, sometimes can leave it quite difficult to interpret. So we looked at this collection of names overall, and about half of them are Irish language names. So Pool na Hasog would mean the whole of the Stoat, Pool na Hasoige. Moan Rua is the red bogland. The Shra field, a Shra, is a broad, shallow river valley, so low land beside a river. Most of them are topographical names of one form or the other. We have English names which have an Irish element, like the Shra field, so it's an English name, but it contains a word derived from Irish. Lots of surnames, Tober so some can be, contain Irish elements, or they're purely English names like Robbinsfield. Lots of personal names, many Irish forms of personal names and surnames and so on. And then the second biggest category is probably English names of all kinds. So the Limekiln, Hanging Field. Hanging Field has nothing to do with hanging people. It relates to, a steep slope which can appear almost to be, overhanging. It's so steep. Crops which are grown in the past, like tobacco field. As I said, English names which contain an Irish element. So Sumra, Sumra is a a swallow hole or a place where water would accumulate, a quagmire of some kind. Um, Local pronunciation, so Backpaster. So the traditional pronunciation of pasture is pastor. Names which come from international events like sorry, I'm just skipping on, Prussia Hill. So it's a common enough occurrence that um, major international events could inspire names of local features. So there was a photograph of a large rock, I think the Spine Cop was called, where important battle was fought during the Boer War. And there are a number of fields called the Spine Cop, which had a rock, a glacial erratic, which was similar in appearance to that photograph. Prussia Hill, I'm not sure the significance of it, but it's probably relating to some event that was somehow associated with an international event. You have lots of Canadas and Australias referring to the field furthest away from the house on the farm, and so on and so on. You've other interesting ones like Sundial Field, the hop yard. So hops have become very well known with the craft beer sort of phenomenon in the last 15 years, but we recorded quite a number of fields such as the hop yard and the hop garden. So hops were obviously widely grown in the past. Furry Hill is furs, which would be the usual word for what's called whins and gorse in some places. I think that's mainly a word used by the media. But furs would be the usual word in Westmeath, and we had one example of Whinny Hill, which is from whin, which is the more common word in the northern part of the country. Okay, so that's the Schools Folklore Collection. So what sort of names have we collected in the last 7 or 8 years in County Westmeath? So one of the most important categories are the names of former owners or inhabitants. So something somebody said to me is most farms in this area are made up of 3 or 4 smaller places. There's been a lot of consolidation of farms, and often the names of the former owners are places where you'd have a site of a house, which could be have been abandoned since the mid 19th century. That name will live on as a field name. Now, a second aspect of surnames as field names is that they often preserve the local pronunciation of the surname. So what has happened in, well, I'd say recent times is that through the influence of education, media, and people have started to pronounce the names as they're spelt, what we call a spelling pronunciation, rather than how they were pronounced traditionally locally. And sometimes the older local pronunciation is preserved in field names. So McDermott in North Westmeath is always Diarmady. People might spell their name McDermott, but nobody ever calls them McDermott. They're always Diarmady. And there are many, many examples of that, or you'd have Dowling, would be Doolin locally and so on. So it's an interesting source for local pronunciation of field names, of surnames, sorry. Another example now would be Shales Field. So this would be the local traditional pronunciation of the surname Shiel. Shale, certainly in the Midlands anyway. That's how it's pronounced, O'Shiel in Irish. Lots of what I would call maybe dialect English words, words which, uh, are not widely used anymore, but are common enough in field names. I include haggart, which isn't really common outside of Ireland as far as I know. And haggart is probably a very commonly known word to people of a certain generation. So it literally comes from hay yard, and it's where the cocks of hay and the corn stacks and so on would have been kept for the winter fodder. And of course, that has all gone by the wayside with first square bales of hay and hay sheds, probably from the 1960s and 70s on, and then from the 1980s, bales of silage, or pit silage and so on. So most haggards today no longer have that purpose. They're probably just a place where bales of silage are stacked up or machinery is parked or whatever. So, a haggard is something which, is rapidly becoming, quite a term with quite restricted usage. Other dialect words would be flaggery field. So, um, flaggers would be the usual word for yellow iris. I don't know if that's the common in other parts of the country, but flags or flaggers would be very common. Furry Park from furs. The slang is a very common one. It's usually a long, narrow strip, maybe along a river or a drain or something. 2 or 3 acres usually is a slang. So it's an English word as well for a long, narrow strip. A word that comes up constantly, but it's a word you'll hardly ever see written down these days, is Mearnan. So there's different spellings. Murray's Mearn is how it was spelt by the volunteer in this case. So literally the boundary of Murray's farm. Walking the Mearns would be, walking around the boundary of the farm to check the fences and so on. So it's a word that comes up all the time, very commonly used, but not one you'd see written down. The Fort Field, the local pronunciation of fort is in ring fort. Marl has become marble hole in this case. So marl is a particular type of subsoil shell marl that you get under peat. And perhaps because of the pronunciation, the very strong emphasis on the R, marl, somebody thought it was marble. Limekiln is always Limekill. The N is never pronounced. You have other words like quicks, the beach quick, probably be a somewhat old-fashioned way of referring to young saplings for planting now. Quicks, I think it's still used to some extent, but maybe not as common as it was. A spa then would be a curative spring. So they're just examples of English words. Lots of words then reflecting crops which are grown in the past. There's not much tillage farming in County Westmeath today, but there obviously was a lot more of it in the past. And also old rural industries. So flax garden, the cabbage field, the beet field, the black oats field, the hop yard. Note the local pronunciation of this one, the soppet, the soppet. So that's the saw pit. So a hole would have been dug in the ground and then a log placed across it with a man above and a man below with a large crosscut saw, would have squared off the log and then cut planks off it. So a kind of an early form of a sawmill, of a sawmill. The sand howl. The sand howl is the sand hole. So, a gravel pit or a sand pit. The local pronunciation maybe would make it difficult for somebody to actually interpret that name, the sand howl. The Coopers then, there was actually, it's the name of a farmyard and a field attached to it where a Cooper worked actually on contract with Guinness and used to make barrels on his own there and send them to Dublin. The forge field, again, the local traditional pronunciation would be forge rather than forge, forge. And then the blade yard. So this is where uh, linen cloth would have been spread out for bleaching. And the linen industry was pretty important all over Ireland in the past, but particularly so around Moate in County Westmeath. The Irish language names make up about 8 to 12% of the names we collected. They're mostly topographical names, names of features in the landscape. And I'd say a lot of them weren't really field names to begin with. They probably go back to the days before enclosure, when the landscape was much more open and you maybe would have just had, a ditch around the boundary of the townland. And they relate to some prominent feature within the townland, some prominent natural feature like a hill or a hollow or a wood or whatever, which was, the most readily identifiable feature in the landscape and was named as a result. And in most townlands where we collect names, there will be at least one Irish language name. And in a lot of cases, I think they go back, as I say, before the townlands were actually divided up in fields, which mostly happened in the 18th and 19th centuries. And they relate to some natural feature which was prominent before that happened. Now, some, for various reasons, we can tell date to later than that period and are subsequent to enclosure. Few examples here which are very common: the Mulla on Mullach, the height or the summit; the Moineen, there are vast numbers of Moineens, a little bog or a moor, and some of them can be absolutely tiny, a half an acre, a quarter of an acre with all mineral soil around them. The Corrock, a moor, and the example here, the photograph, we actually have that on an estate map which shows that it was originally on Corrock Dove, and you can see the black peat soil and the flat topography there, of which is typical of a Corrock or a marsh or a moor. A little river name we came across, and I think there was actually about 6 examples in total of this came up. But one particular example I remember from Cool in Northwest Meath is the Comogue, which is actually a small stream which is only about 800 or 900 meters long and has one curve in it, which has given it its name. Comogue, com meaning crooked, so Comogue, the little crooked one. The Puncon, this is actually the name of a hump in a bog road, which is kind of infamous for taking lumps out of the bottom of people's cars. And it comes from an Irish word boncon, which itself is a borrowing from English bank and literally means a small earth bank. We also get the word puncon in other field names where it refers to tussock sedge. So it occurs in quite a number of field names. And then the Cruachan, pronounced Cruachan as it would be in Connacht Irish, which it seems Westmeath, belong to that dialect area. There are many, many examples, a little hillock. You get full Irish names surviving, like Clún na Gwenyin, the meadow of the rabbits, Ord na Mó, the height of the cows, as well. Just look at one townland in more detail here, conscious of time now. And I don't know if people can read the text on the slide here, but we have this field here, Cacahuala. So literally the shit of the townland. In this case, cock or excrement doesn't literally refer to excrement. I think it means, the worst soil in the townland, Cacahuala. It's all mineral soil in this area. It's very flat though, and I'd say it was probably, heavier land, more difficult to till, less free draining and so on. And so it got the name Cacahuala, which it retains to this day. Another one here is Lissacaun, which means the little ring fort, which is actually a huge ring fort. It's about an acre and a half in area. So there must have been an even bigger one somewhere nearby because it was called Lissacaun. And down here we have the Loughean. And actually, one of the reasons I probably got interested in field names and place names in the first place is hearing names like this growing up. So I remember this name being used by a man called Johnny Murray, who used to call to our house with honey, and he owned the land. He probably would have died, I'd say, over 30 years ago now, but he was always talking about the Loughean, which was, he owned that field. And those sort of things, I suppose, had an impact on me, and it's probably why I got interested in this sort of work. Another one here is the corner of Clúd in a townland called Rath. and it seems to be sort of a tautological translation of the Irish word clúid, which means a nook or a corner. And it's this area here, just bound by a small river. It's all forestry now, so it's totally unrecognizable. But this is an aerial photograph from the 1990s, and you can see it's an area of about 3 acres, and it is very much sort of a nook between the bog and the river. And there are a few other examples in the area of the same thing. Conscious of time now, so I'm not going to dwell too much on this one, but Tobar Yura is the name of a well of Yurok, a place of use, and it's in an area with very little woodland, very open landscape. So it probably is a relic of an old woodland, an old yew woodland, which existed there in the past. And I think these names are very important in terms of reading how the landscape has changed over time. Farm names are a relatively uncommon category. So, as I say, usually field names are really feature names, the name of some prominent feature in the landscape, and then they've become attached to a field as the fields were enclosed and contained that feature within it. But names of whole farms, so, a big block of land, are not that common, but they do exist. So we have Corn of Wintog and Carlinstown up near the Meath border. It's this big block of, I think, 60 acres. No house in it, even going back to 19th century maps. And Corn of Wintog means, Cor is usually a hill, a round hill of the ash trees. It's probably this hilly area up here. And interestingly, it survives in two forms locally. So there are two forms of the word Fuintog, common in Irish. Fuintog, ash tree, is actually a diminutive form and is the most common, but you also get Fuinche, which is the original word in some place names. So I actually recorded these a few years ago. Now, so go ahead there, Sean. Okay. So that's Cornawincha. And then another person from the same area called it. Yeah, go ahead there whenever you want, Paddy.
Cornawinchog.
No.
No.
So let's go ahead there, Sean. It's always known as. Yeah, go ahead there whenever you want. Okay, my recording won't stop now, but I'll jump on. So you can get different versions of names in circulation at the same time. This is another farm name. It's, I think, a block of about 10 acres. Kappa Hollow near Kildare. And it's sort of been reinterpreted, the second part, as hollow, as there is a low area and a little river running through it. But it's actually the Irish word calla, which is a riverside meadow, just in the genitive case here, inflected in the genitive case. So it's capach on chala, the tillage plot of the calla. And we can actually see the old ridge and furrow sort of impressions here in the aerial photograph. And it seems that this piece of land hasn't been improved, certainly within living. It wasn't tilled, it's quite rocky. So it is quite an interesting landscape relic. This is the type of land it is. So Capach and Chala. And as I said, there is a river and floods regularly here in the centre of it. Finally, we have lots of what were formerly villages. I'm going to skip on to that one and look at this one, the village of Trum. So if you look at the photograph here, that's what it looks now. It's just a huge, big empty field of about 50 or 60 acres. But there was a little village here of 3 houses, a little house cluster. And Trum is the Irish for an elder tree. And in recording the name, our volunteer said Michael Cunningham, a local tradesman, removed the last building stone from the site in 1920, 1930 to line a well dug by hand at his parents' house in Lissanode. So, amazing contextual information of exactly how these kind of features disappeared from the landscape, presumably abandoned in the 19th century and then the stone gradually removed to be reused elsewhere. The defining feature of this cluster of houses must have been a big elder tree, a trum. And this is the last one, as I know Alva will stop me soon. This is an unusual one. It's a children's burial ground called Alona Lana, which is sort of an interpretation of the Cuine Acón Elanov. And it's just a little rocky patch in a field. You can see the outcrop there on the OS map. And I think it would have been chosen as a site for a children's burial ground because it was rocky. There would have been less chance of the ground being disturbed by tillage. And it was located in a sheep walk, so a big unenclosed area of open land where people could go in there without, I suppose, being seen as trespassers and so on. So um, I think we'll leave it at that, and we'll take a few questions.
That was fantastic, Angus. Thanks a million. I was going to, yeah, stop at five. Just that's great, great timing. That was so interesting, and it's amazing how reflective the place names are of our landscape and our traditions and cultures. There's a lot hidden in them, isn't there? That's really amazing. So, if anyone has any questions, they can put it into the chat there, and I will ask Angus. So type away if you have any questions. And while you're thinking of some, I was fascinated by the word haggard because I grew up on a farm in Wicklow, with my dad had a small farm with beef dry stock, but the haggard I never actually knew what that referred to other than just where the hay was, but I didn't know that that was like an old name. That was really interesting.
Yeah, it's peculiar to Ireland, really. I don't think it's used in English. It is an English word, but I don't think it's used much outside of Ireland.
Yeah,
So
that's
yeah,
great. And the other one that caught my eye was the flaggery field. The yellow iris is also like just known as the flag iris, so that makes a lot of sense that it would be the flaggery. Yeah.
flaggers are a major problem in the Midlands. So yeah,
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah,
lots of
yeah,
flaggery fields and flaggery gardens and so on.
yeah. It's just brilliant. Thanks a million. Um, so there's one question here from Orla. Where is the best source of maps to start with?
So we used Ordnance Survey historic maps. So you can get those on GeoHive, or I think it's there's another website that the Ordnance Survey or Tailteann Éireann have as well. So we use those now. The county council supplied us with them. We used the OS 6-inch map, which would be sort of early 20th century. So they have the field boundaries are very clear. So if you're printing them on A3 sheets or whatever, we found those to be the best maps to use. But there are other maps you could use as well, but they have universal coverage. And also, if you're collecting names from farmers, farmers are very familiar with those maps from their Area 8 forums and so on, so they're usually able to read them very quickly. Another thing you can do is just print aerial photography, you know, print from Google Maps. And, sometimes they can be useful, especially where there's been a lot of land reclamation and fields, uh, you know, small fields laid into one so people can orientate themselves. So that's usually how we did it. Or sometimes if you have a paper map and have a laptop open and Google Maps as well, it can help people to orientate themselves. Yeah.
That's brilliant. Thank you. Um, there, where are we here now? Tony says, fascinating talk and excellent slides. Thanks very much, Angus. Very true. It was brilliant. Neve's asking, wondering if there is more available on the place names of the burn apart from Tim Robinson's maps, notes on this
Yeah.
possibly.
I think there have been a couple of projects. Certainly, I had a few people in touch with me about interpretation of particular names from Kilnaboy, definitely, and maybe also down in South Clare as well, around Shannon. I think this group have been collecting there. So I think there's several community groups have been collecting names in different parts of Clare. So I couldn't point you specifically to anything online, but say if you got onto the Heritage Officer in Clare County Council, you might be able to find out what's going on.
That's great.
And there's the Schools Folklore Collection as well. Go into any national school on duchess.ie and you're very likely to find a collection of field names from the area.
Brilliant. Connie says, I was just asking if this will be available online because it's so interesting. And yes, this is recorded, so it'll be up on the Burn Bio YouTube page. So it'll definitely be accessible again to go back over because there was lots of information in there and it was all so interesting. And if there are no more questions, oh, we've one nice burn field, Craig Nagower. Craig Nagower is so rocky that only a goat could cross it. That makes sense with the name.
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
with a few. Yeah, I was actually trying to look up names for rocky areas in Westmeath, which obviously wouldn't be as rocky as maybe the Burren, but actually there was a lot of limestone outcrop. If you look at the old Ordnance Survey maps, even in counties like Westmeath, almost all of which has disappeared in the last
yeah.
100 years. And it does survive in the field names. So one of the very common names is Coron, which means a small rocky patch or a rough patch. And we've come across loads of those, and sometimes when you look at the field now, there's no trace of any rocks. But if you look at the Ordnance Survey maps, the entire field was covered in rocks, in the recent
Wow.
past. So,
Wow.
bulldozers kind of have changed things quite a lot. So, yeah, there was a lot more rocky fields, not just in Clare, but in different parts of Ireland. And we do
Yeah.
get Craig, even occasionally in Screg, which would probably relate to some kind of pavement almost.
Mm.
Yeah, so the names can show what the landscape used to look like as well.
Yeah, they hold so much history and are so reflective of the landscape, which is amazing. Louise says lots of variations of spellings in the 1926 census. For example, Lochnafoylan or Lochonawhelan for the
Yeah,
same.
I was always told when I was being trained in place names never to guess the meaning of a place name just based on one spelling. But
Yes.
I'm going to break that rule and say it is probably the Lake of the Seagulls. Loch
Oh, the seagulls. All right.
Yeah, Loch na or Loch na depending on the dialect. The seagulls are Fáileán in Connemara Irish. But so this is
Okay.
probably from Clare, but might be Loch na Yeah.
God, that's brilliant. That's fantastic. Great. If there is no more questions, I will end it there just because it's 1 minute past 9. I know we had a bit of a slow start, but I don't want to go over and keep anyone for the rest of the evening. So, Aengus, thanks a million again. That was really, really interesting. And this will be definitely recorded and posted onto the YouTube page if anyone wants to rewatch it. Um, and have a lovely evening, everyone, and thank you for attending. And thanks again, Aengus.
Okay, thanks very much, Alva, and thanks everybody
Fantastic.
for listening.
Good night, everyone.